Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of courage, empowerment, and the strength of the human spirit. Today's story takes us 35,000 feet above the ground, aboard a flight where one woman's quiet strength transformed a moment of entitlement into a profound lesson in respect and dignity. Stay tuned as we explore the resilience of Olivia Taylor, the challenges she faced, and the life-changing outcome that left everyone on board speechless. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to join us on this incredible journey. Let's dive into today's story. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting warm hues of amber and gold across the tarmac as Olivia Taylor eased into her first-class seat. Seat 1A. It was a place she had dreamed of reaching, not just for its luxury but for what it symbolized: years of effort, sacrifice, and triumph. From the small, bustling streets of Chicago to her role as CEO of Taylor Technologies, a company she had built from scratch, every milestone in her journey carried a weight far heavier than the polished leather of her seat. Olivia had grown up in a neighborhood where dreams often felt like distant stars, visible but always just out of reach. Yet, her parents instilled in her the belief that persistence and integrity could bridge even the widest gaps. That belief had been her anchor. She looked out the window as the last streaks of sunlight gave way to the cool blue of twilight, thinking about the partnership she was about to finalize overseas. It wasn't just another deal, it was the beginning of a new chapter for her company, a validation of everything she had worked for. The atmosphere in the cabin was serene. The soft hum of the engines mingled with the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee, creating an almost meditative calm. Olivia's leather briefcase rested beside her, containing meticulously prepared documents that represented months of late nights and early mornings. For now, she allowed herself a moment of stillness, savoring a glass of sparkling water handed to her by the flight attendant. This, she thought, was a rare indulgence, time to breathe. But peace, as life often reminds us, is fleeting. The commotion began subtly, a raised voice, the shuffle of feet, before it burst into the cabin like an unwelcome gust of wind. Olivia looked up to see a tall blonde woman striding down the aisle, her posture taut with indignation. The woman, whose designer handbag swung purposefully at her side, was accompanied by a quieter companion who seemed hesitant, almost apologetic. The blonde's voice carried with it the sharpness of entitlement. "I can't believe this mix-up," she exclaimed, turning to her friend. "Seat 1A has always been mine. Always." Olivia felt a pang of unease but turned back to her briefcase, hoping the situation would resolve itself without incident. Yet, her instincts told her otherwise. Moments later, the woman, whose name Olivia would later learn was Madison Carter, stood before her with a smile so forced it felt like a challenge. "There seems to be a mistake," Madison said, her tone laced with condescension. "This is my seat. I think they must have given it to you in error." Olivia looked up, her expression calm but firm. "I booked this seat weeks ago," she replied, her voice steady. Madison's smile faltered, but her determination didn't. "I'm a frequent flyer with this airline," she said, her voice hardening. "They know I always sit here. You'd probably be more comfortable in another seat. Perhaps in business class?" Olivia had faced this before. The quiet, cutting way people like Madison assessed her, dismissed her, and attempted to claim what wasn't theirs. The weight of it was familiar, but familiarity didn't make it any less exhausting. "I'm perfectly comfortable right here," Olivia said, her tone resolute. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Madison's polished facade cracked slightly as her lips pressed into a thin line. Her companion shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing to be elsewhere. A flight attendant approached, his professional demeanor offering a temporary buffer to the brewing conflict. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between Olivia and Madison. "Yes, there is," Madison said quickly, her voice adopting a dramatic edge. "This seat, my seat, has been given away. I need it corrected immediately." The attendant turned to Olivia, his expression neutral but tinged with skepticism. "May I see your boarding pass?" Without hesitation, Olivia handed it over. Her calmness was deliberate, a shield against the storm brewing around her. As the attendant studied the pass, Olivia's heartbeat remained steady. She had learned long ago not to let others' doubts rattle her. The attendant nodded after a moment. "This is indeed your seat, Ms. Taylor." Madison's frustration bubbled over. "That can't be right," she muttered, her voice sharp. She must have upgraded at the last minute. "People do that all the time." Olivia's gaze met Madison's, unwavering. "I suggest you take the seat you were assigned," she said, her tone calm but unyielding. "This conversation is over." Madison's companion tugged at her sleeve, whispering something inaudible. But Madison wasn't ready to retreat. Her voice dropped low, simmering with anger. "Do you even know who I am?" Before she could say more, the flight attendant stepped in, his tone firmer now. If you have concerns, you're welcome to speak with our supervisor. But this seat is taken." For a long moment, Madison stood there, her fury barely contained. Finally, with a sharp huff, she turned on her heel and stormed away, her companion trailing behind. Olivia exhaled softly, aware of the eyes on her from other passengers. The judgment in their gazes was palpable, but she didn't let it linger in her mind. This wasn't the first time she'd had to defend her space, her right to exist in places where others assumed she didn't belong. And she knew it wouldn't be the last. But tonight, she resolved, she would not let anyone diminish her worth. Not tonight. Not ever. The calm that returned to the cabin after Madison's retreat was short-lived. Olivia had just begun reviewing her notes for the upcoming business meeting when the faint click of the cabin door announced the arrival of the final wave of passengers. As Olivia glanced up briefly, a new figure entered the first-class section, a tall woman with platinum blonde hair swept into a flawless twist. She exuded an air of authority that seemed to precede her. Behind her, another woman struggled to keep up, lugging an oversized tote that seemed to weigh her down as much as her nervous energy. The woman in the cream blazer paused halfway down the aisle, her sharp gaze scanning the seats until it landed on Olivia. Her lips curved into a faint, tight smile that carried no warmth, only curiosity and subtle judgment. She turned to the flight attendant walking by and flagged him down with a quick, commanding gesture. "Excuse me," she said, her voice precise and clipped. "There's clearly been a mistake. I'm supposed to be seated in 1A. The attendant's professional smile faltered momentarily before he replied. "Let me check for you. Could I have your boarding pass?" The woman handed it over with a swift motion, not even sparing a glance at Olivia, as though the issue had already been resolved in her favor. As the attendant scanned his tablet and then looked at the ticket, his brow furrowed slightly. "I'm sorry," he said carefully, "but your assigned seat is actually 3C. Seat 1A was reserved in advance by Ms. Taylor." The woman, Jessica Moore, Olivia would later learn, let out a soft, incredulous laugh, as though the mere suggestion of her not sitting in 1A was absurd. 3C, she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "That's unacceptable. I always sit in 1A. I'm a Platinum Preferred member. Surely there's been some kind of mix-up. Perhaps she upgraded last minute." Jessica tilted her head slightly in Olivia's direction without ever looking at her directly, her words oozing condescension. Olivia set down her notebook and removed her reading glasses, her expression calm as she met Jessica's gaze for the first time. "I didn't upgrade," Olivia said evenly. "This is my seat. And I booked it weeks ago." Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly, and her faint smile disappeared. "I see," she said, her voice lower now but still brimming with entitlement. "Well, I'm sure you'd be much more comfortable in business class. Why not let me have this seat? And we can both avoid a scene." Olivia leaned back slightly, her calm unshaken. "I'm perfectly comfortable right where I am," she replied. The tension in the cabin grew heavier. the soft hum of the engines now the only sound breaking the silence. Olivia noticed the other passengers pretending to read or scroll through their phones, though their darting glances betrayed their curiosity. Jessica, clearly unaccustomed to being denied, turned back to the flight attendant. Her tone now sharp. "You must be able to do something. Move her to another seat. I shouldn't have to deal with this." The attendant, visibly uncomfortable, responded cautiously. I'm afraid Ms. Taylor has every right to remain in her seat. It was properly reserved." Jessica's frustration bubbled to the surface. She took a step closer to Olivia, her voice dropping just enough to sound more threatening than polite. "Do you even know who I am?" she demanded, her tone dripping with indignation. Without missing a beat, Olivia replied, "No, I don't. But I do know who I am, and that's the person sitting in this seat." The reply seemed to momentarily disarm Jessica, but her indignation quickly returned. Before she could respond, the flight attendant stepped in once again, this time with more authority in his tone. He said, "If you'd like to escalate this further, I can call the supervisor. But I need you to take your assigned seat so we can prepare for takeoff." Jessica hesitated, her gaze darting between Olivia and the attendant. The air around her was charged with tension, as though she were calculating her next move. Then, with a huff of exasperation, she muttered, "This isn't over," and stormed off to her assigned seat, her companion trailing behind her like a shadow. As the cabin settled once more, Olivia allowed herself a small exhale. She knew this wasn't the end of it, but she had learned long ago that holding her ground was sometimes the most powerful statement she could make. She turned back to her notebook, her pen poised over the page. There were bigger battles ahead, and Olivia knew she needed to save her energy for what truly mattered. But as she wrote, a quiet resolve settled over her, whatever came next. She was ready. Olivia had just managed to find her focus again when the next wave of tension swept through the cabin. A few seats behind her, Jessica Moore was deep in conversation with the flight attendant, her voice sharp and unwavering, despite the low murmur of her words. It was clear she wasn't letting the matter rest. Olivia caught snippets of phrases like platinum status, unacceptable treatment, and someone like her, which sent a familiar twinge of frustration through her. Olivia had dealt with people like Jessica countless times before, individuals who believed their status or privilege entitled them to more than others. Still, it didn't make these encounters any less draining. She adjusted the silk scarf around her neck and tried to return her attention to her notes, though she could feel the storm brewing behind her. It wasn't long before the flight supervisor, a woman in her early 40s with neatly styled hair and a crisp uniform, arrived at Jessica's seat. Her presence immediately drew attention, her posture and deliberate movements exuding authority. After a brief exchange with Jessica, the supervisor, Diana Lang, Olivia later learned, began walking toward the first-class cabin, her expression neutral but her steps purposeful. Stopping beside Olivia's seat, Diana offered a polite smile, though there was a hint of tension in her demeanor. "Ms. Taylor," she began, her voice professional but slightly hesitant, "I understand there's been a disagreement about seating. I was hoping we might resolve this amicably." Olivia set her pen down and folded her hands in her lap, meeting Diana's gaze with calm composure. "There's no disagreement," Olivia said firmly. "This is my seat. I booked it weeks ago and have no intention of moving." Diana nodded slowly, her professionalism slipping slightly under the weight of the moment. "I understand. But Ms. Moore is one of our platinum members. She's flown with us for years, and we do try to accommodate our most loyal customers. Perhaps we could find you another seat in first class? It would make things easier for everyone." Olivia tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanging. "I'm sure it would," she replied, her voice steady. "But I'm not the one making things difficult. I paid for this seat, and I intend to stay in it. Ms. Moore is welcome to sit where she's assigned." Diana's smile tightened, and for a moment, Olivia could see the conflict in her eyes. The supervisor was caught between a high-status customer and the growing realization that Olivia wasn't someone she could simply pressure into compliance. "Of course," Diana said after a pause, her tone still measured. "But I must ask, would you reconsider? It's only a small adjustment. And it would prevent any further escalation." Olivia leaned back slightly, her gaze unwavering. Respectfully. "No," she said. The firm yet polite refusal left Diana momentarily at a loss. She glanced toward Jessica, whose sharp gaze was fixed on them like a hawk watching its prey. With no resolution in sight, Diana stepped away, her expression strained, and approached Jessica once more. The exchange between the two women was hushed but tense. Olivia didn't need to hear their words to know the outcome. Jessica's indignation radiated from her like a storm cloud. Eventually, Diana returned, her voice quieter this time. "Thank you for your patience, Ms. Taylor," she said. "We'll do our best to ensure the situation doesn't disrupt your flight any further." Olivia nodded, offering no further response. As Diana retreated, Olivia noticed Jessica glaring at her from across the cabin. She could feel the weight of the woman's simmering resentment but chose to ignore it, her focus returning to the pages of her notebook. As the engines hummed steadily in the background, Olivia reflected on the familiar pattern of these encounters. It wasn't just about a seat or status, it was about assumptions. About how people saw her and how they thought they could treat her. But she had learned long ago that she didn't need to meet their hostility with anger. Strength came in holding her ground, in not letting their behavior define her. For now, she resolved to remain calm. But deep down, Olivia sensed that this storm had not yet passed. The plane's cabin was quiet, but the tension in the air felt almost tangible. Olivia could sense the growing frustration in Jessica more even without looking her way. Across the aisle, passengers cast subtle glances toward the brewing confrontation, their curiosity barely masked by the screens of their tablets and phones. Olivia continued writing in her notebook, her deliberate focus serving as both a shield and a statement. She was not here to entertain their assumptions or expectations. Jessica, however, wasn't finished. Her voice, though lowered in an attempt to maintain an air of civility, was just loud enough for Olivia to catch phrases like disrespectful behavior and someone of my standing. Olivia let the words roll off her shoulders. She'd encountered these tactics before. The escalation of rhetoric meant to wear her down, to make her feel small. But Olivia wasn't about to let Jessica or anyone else control the narrative. Moments later, Diana Lang, the flight supervisor, returned to Jessica's side. From the corner of her eye, Olivia watched as Diana leaned in, speaking softly to Jessica in what appeared to be an attempt at de-escalation. But Jessica was no longer merely frustrated, she was determined. Her voice carried the same sharp edge it had from the start. "This isn't just about a seat," Jessica hissed, loud enough for Olivia to hear. "It's about principle. I shouldn't have to fight for what's rightfully mine." Diana's response was inaudible, but Jessica's reaction was clear. She threw her hands up in exasperation, her platinum membership badge catching the light as she gestured toward Olivia's seat. "I don't care what she paid for," Jessica snapped, her voice rising. "Do you know who I am? I'm not about to be treated like this." Olivia sighed softly, closing her notebook with measured care. She turned her head, her calm gaze meeting Diana's hesitant one. "Is there something you need from me?" Olivia asked, her voice steady but firm enough to cut through the tension. Diana hesitated, clearly caught between her professional obligations and the growing chaos. "Ms. Taylor," she began cautiously, "we're trying to find a resolution that satisfies everyone. Would you consider moving to another seat? Just this once. It's still in first class, and it would allow us to avoid further disruption." Olivia's calm never wavered, though her tone sharpened just slightly. "Ms. Lang," she replied, "if you're asking me to sacrifice what I've earned for someone else's comfort, my answer is no. I paid for this seat. And I have every right to remain in it. The disruption isn't coming from me. Diana's shoulders tensed. The firmness in Olivia's response left no room for misinterpretation. Across the aisle, Jessica glared at Olivia with a venomous intensity, her polished facade crumbling into open hostility. Before Diana could respond, Jessica stood abruptly, drawing the attention of nearly everyone in the cabin. "This is absurd," she exclaimed, her voice echoing through the quiet space. "She doesn't belong here. And you all know it." The words hung in the air like a slap. Olivia's heart remained steady, though she felt the sting of Jessica's audacity. It wasn't the first time she'd faced this level of blatant disrespect. But it didn't make it any less cutting. Slowly, Olivia rose from her seat, the movement deliberate and commanding. She turned to face Jessica, her expression calm but unyielding. "What I belong to," Olivia said, her voice steady and deliberate, "is the truth. And the truth is, this is my seat. And your sense of entitlement doesn't change that." A hushed silence fell over the cabin. Passengers who had been silently observing the drama now exchanged wide-eyed glances, unsure of how to react. Jessica seemed momentarily stunned, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to form a response. Diana stepped forward, her tone firmer now. "Ms. Moore," she said, her words deliberate, "I need you to take your assigned seat, or I'll have no choice but to escalate this further." Jessica hesitated, visibly fuming but unwilling to risk further embarrassment. With a final glare at Olivia, she turned and marched back to her assigned seat, her footsteps heavy with indignation. As Jessica settled in, Olivia calmly returned to her own seat, smoothing the pages of her notebook as though nothing had happened. Yet she couldn't ignore the weight of the stares around her, some curious, others judgmental, and a few, perhaps, quietly admiring. Whatever came next, Olivia reminded herself, she would handle it with the same calm resilience she always had. The storm might not be over, but she would weather it. She always did. The first-class cabin had settled into a tense quiet after Jessica's retreat. Olivia could feel the undercurrent of judgment and curiosity from the passengers around her, though none dared to say anything. She kept her gaze steady on her notebook, her pen poised over the page. Writing had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could focus her thoughts and channel her energy. But even as she tried to focus, she couldn't entirely block out the tension that lingered in the air like static. Across the aisle, Jessica was far from subdued. Her companion, a petite woman who Olivia guessed was a colleague or assistant, whispered something to her, but Jessica waved her off dismissively. Olivia caught fragments of Jessica's muttered complaints, completely unfair, ridiculous. Someone like that. The phrases struck a familiar chord, their weight heavier than the words themselves. Olivia had heard these kinds of veiled remarks all her life. They weren't just about her seat, they were about her very presence. Olivia's gaze flicked briefly to Jessica, who was glaring at her as though Olivia were the source of all her problems. She recognized the look, part frustration, part disbelief, and entirely fueled by entitlement. Jessica wasn't just angry at the situation, she was angry because someone like Olivia had refused to yield. But Olivia wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. She returned her focus to her notes, her calm demeanor a deliberate choice. If Jessica wanted to escalate further, Olivia would be ready. Moments later, a quiet voice broke the silence. "Ms. Taylor." Olivia looked up to see Diana Lang standing beside her again, her expression carefully neutral. There was a slight hesitation in Diana's posture, as though she were bracing herself for resistance. "Yes," Olivia replied, her tone polite but firm. Diana lowered her voice, her professionalism tinged with unease. "I've spoken with Ms. Moore again, but she's still dissatisfied with the situation. She's requested that I bring this matter to the captain's attention." Olivia arched an eyebrow. surprised but not entirely shocked. "The captain?" she asked. Her voice steady. "Yes," Diana said, shifting uncomfortably. "In situations like this, it's sometimes necessary to involve them to ensure the flight proceeds without further disruption." Olivia paused, taking a measured breath before responding. "You're welcome to bring the captain into this, Ms. Lang," she said calmly. "But let me be clear, I will not be moving from this seat. I booked it. I paid for it. And I have every right to remain here." Diana's shoulders tensed, her professional mask slipping ever so slightly. "I understand," she said carefully. "But I hope we can resolve this without further escalation." Olivia met Diana's gaze, her expression unwavering. "So do I," she said simply. Diana nodded curtly and stepped away, her heels clicking against the carpeted floor as she headed toward the cockpit. As she disappeared from view, Olivia felt the tension in the cabin thicken once again. Jessica sat upright in her seat, her gaze fixed on Olivia with a triumphant glint in her eyes, as though she believed the captain's involvement would finally tip the scales in her favor. Olivia leaned back in her seat and exhaled slowly. She had faced harder battles than this, ones that had tested not just her patience but her very sense of self-worth. She had learned to navigate these challenges with grace and resolve. But they always left a mark. This one was no different. As the minutes passed, the faint click of the cockpit door opening drew everyone's attention. A tall man in a crisp uniform emerged, his presence commanding immediate respect. His gaze swept the cabin briefly before settling on Diana, who had risen to meet him. Olivia watched as Diana gestured toward her, and the captain nodded, his expression neutral. As he approached, the quiet hum of conversation in the cabin died completely, leaving only the steady thrum of the engines. "Ms. Taylor," the captain said, his tone professional but firm. Olivia straightened in her seat and met his gaze. "Yes, Captain," she replied. "I understand there's been an issue with seating arrangements," he said, his voice even. "I'd like to hear your side of the story." Olivia nodded and began to explain, her words calm and precise. She told him how she had booked the seat weeks ago, how the confusion had arisen, and how she had refused to give it up simply because another passenger believed she was more entitled to it. The captain listened intently, his expression giving nothing away. When Olivia finished, he nodded once and turned to Diana. "Thank you, Ms. Lang. I'll handle it from here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Olivia remained composed, her gaze steady as the captain turned his attention to Jessica. Whatever happened next, she was ready. She always was. The captain turned to Jessica Moore, his sharp gaze assessing her as he stood tall in the aisle. The air around him was charged with authority, and even Jessica seemed momentarily hesitant under his scrutiny. Olivia observed quietly, her outward calm belying the storm of emotions brewing beneath the surface. These encounters always carried a weight beyond the moment, touching on deeper issues of respect, entitlement, and the subtle indignities she had faced countless times before. "Ms. Moore," the captain began, his voice steady but commanding. "I understand there's been some confusion about seating. Can you explain the issue from your perspective?" Jessica's confidence reignited under his attention, her voice adopting a tone of exaggerated grievance. "Captain, I've been a loyal Platinum Preferred member with this airline for years. I always sit in seat 1A, it's practically my spot. Somehow, my seat was given to her." She gestured sharply toward Olivia. "Even though I've never had this problem before, it's completely unacceptable." The captain listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Jessica finished, he turned back to Olivia. "Ms. Taylor," he said, his tone measured, "you've explained that you booked this seat in advance and that your boarding pass confirms it. Is there anything else you'd like to add?" Olivia met his gaze with calm resolve. "Captain, the situation is simple. This is my seat. I booked it weeks ago. I paid for it. And I have no intention of moving. I understand Ms. Moore's frustration. But her loyalty to the airline doesn't entitle her to displace another passenger. Her words hung in the air, steady and deliberate. Olivia noticed a flicker of understanding in the captain's eyes before he turned back to Jessica. "Ms. Moore," he said, his voice firm but diplomatic. "While I understand your concerns, I've reviewed the information provided, and Seat 1A is correctly assigned to Ms. Taylor. I must ask you to respect the seating arrangement and take your assigned seat." Jessica's jaw tightened, her polished exterior beginning to crack. "This is outrageous," she exclaimed, her voice rising. "I've spent years flying with this airline, and this is how I'm treated. Do you even know who I am?" The captain remained unfazed. "I do know who you are, Ms. Moore, and I appreciate your loyalty. However, loyalty does not override the rules. The seat assignment stands." Jessica's face reddened, her frustration bubbling over. "This isn't just about a seat," she snapped. "It's about principle. I shouldn't have to fight for what's rightfully mine." The captain's expression hardened slightly. "Ms. Moore," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "if you're unable to comply with this seating arrangement, I will have no choice but to escalate this matter further. Please return to your assigned seat so we can proceed with the flight." Jessica's indignation turned to disbelief. "You're siding with her?" she asked, her voice dripping with incredulity. "This is unacceptable. I demand to speak to someone higher up." The captain's patience had clearly reached its limit. "Ms. Moore," he said firmly, "I am the highest authority on this flight. My decision is final. If you continue to refuse, you will be removed from the plane." The weight of his words silenced Jessica for a moment. Her eyes darted around the cabin, searching for support. But the other passengers avoided her gaze. No one was on her side. Finally, with a sharp exhale of frustration, Jessica sank back into her assigned seat, her expression a mixture of fury and humiliation. "You haven't heard the last of this," she muttered. But her voice lacked the force it had carried earlier. The captain turned back to Olivia, his demeanor softening slightly. "Thank you for your patience, Ms. Taylor," he said. "We'll ensure the rest of your flight is as smooth as possible." Olivia inclined her head politely. "Thank you, Captain." As he walked away, the cabin seemed to release a collective breath. The tension that had gripped the passengers began to ease. Though Olivia knew the situation was far from over, Jessica's simmering anger was palpable, and Olivia could feel the weight of the unspoken judgments around her. Returning to her notebook, Olivia allowed herself a moment to reflect. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about standing firm in the face of entitlement and ensuring that respect was not something anyone could demand, it was something that had to be earned. Whatever lingering resentment Jessica held, Olivia knew one thing: she would not let it shake her. Not now. Not ever. The cabin settled into a strained quiet after the captain's firm decision. But it was a fragile peace, one that Olivia knew could shatter at any moment. Across the aisle, Jessica Moore sat rigidly in her seat, her fingers tapping a tense rhythm against the armrest. Her face, still flushed with anger, betrayed her brewing resentment. Olivia, however, refused to engage further. She turned her attention back to her notebook, letting the quiet rustle of her pen against the page drown out the undercurrent of tension. But Jessica wasn't finished. Olivia could feel her eyes boring into her, sharp and unyielding, as if trying to will her into submission. For several minutes, Jessica remained silent, her companion whispering cautiously beside her. But eventually, the dam broke. "This is unacceptable," Jessica hissed, her voice low but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I'm a loyal customer. I don't deserve this kind of treatment." The murmurs around the cabin started again, passengers exchanging uncomfortable glances but remaining silent. Olivia kept her focus on her notes, her calm composure an unspoken rebuke to Jessica's outburst. Jessica's voice grew louder, her anger spilling over as she gestured toward Olivia. "She shouldn't even be sitting there," she said, her tone venomous. People like her think they can just take what they want. The words hit Olivia like a slap. Not for their originality but for their blatant disrespect. She paused, her pen hovering over the page, and looked up, meeting Jessica's glare with a steady gaze. "Ms. Moore," Olivia said evenly, her voice cutting through the cabin. "If you have an issue with the airline's seating arrangements, I suggest you take it up with them. But I won't sit here and let you insult me." Jessica recoiled slightly, as if not expecting Olivia to respond. But her indignation flared again almost immediately. "I'm not insulting you," she snapped. "I'm just stating the facts. You don't belong in that seat." Olivia set her pen down carefully, her movements deliberate and calm. Rising slowly, she faced Jessica directly, her expression unflinching. "And what makes you think I don't belong here?" Olivia asked, her voice steady but laced with quiet authority. Jessica faltered, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for an answer that wouldn't incriminate her further. "I just meant, well, someone like me has been in this seat for years. It's always been my spot. You wouldn't understand." A hush fell over the cabin as Olivia took a step closer, her calm presence somehow more commanding than Jessica's loud indignation. "You're right," Olivia said softly. "I don't understand why you think your history with this airline gives you more rights than me. I don't understand why you think your status should overshadow the fact that I paid for this seat, just like you paid for yours. And I don't understand why you think it's acceptable to try to intimidate me into giving up what's mine." Jessica's face reddened further. But this time she didn't respond. The weight of Olivia's words seemed to hang in the air, silencing any retort Jessica might have had. "Respect," Olivia continued, her voice firm but calm, "isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn. And right now, Ms. Moore, you're earning nothing but the discomfort of everyone around you." The quiet that followed was deafening. Jessica sat back in her seat, her mouth set in a thin line, as Olivia calmly returned to hers. The passengers around them shifted in their seats, their whispers subdued, as though they had just witnessed something far more profound than a mere argument. Olivia opened her notebook again, her fingers smoothing the edges of the pages. The confrontation wasn't just about Jessica's entitlement, it was about every moment in Olivia's life where she had been made to feel like an outsider, like she didn't belong. And in this moment, Olivia had reclaimed that narrative not just for herself but for everyone who had ever faced the same. She exhaled quietly, her resolve stronger than ever. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on. She always did. The tension in the cabin was like a coiled spring, every passenger aware that something significant had just unfolded. Jessica Moore sat stiffly in her seat, her face a mix of embarrassment and anger. Olivia, on the other hand, had returned to her notebook with the same deliberate focus she'd maintained throughout the ordeal. It wasn't just an act of calm, it was a declaration. She refused to let Jessica's behavior disrupt her peace or her purpose. The murmurs among the passengers grew quieter as the minutes ticked by. Olivia caught glimpses of their glances, some curious, others quietly admiring, but she paid them little mind. Her focus was on the upcoming meeting, the partnership she was about to finalize overseas, and the broader impact of standing her ground. It was then that the cabin door opened again, and two sharply dressed corporate representatives stepped inside. Their presence commanded immediate attention, their tailored suits and composed demeanor suggesting they were here to settle matters decisively. Diana Lang, the flight supervisor, moved quickly to meet them, her usual confidence visibly shaken. The taller of the two men introduced himself, his voice calm but authoritative. "We're from corporate. We understand there's been an issue on board that requires resolution." Diana nodded, gesturing toward the first-class section. "Yes, sir. The situation involves Ms. Taylor and Ms. Moore. It's a dispute over seating." The representatives exchanged a brief look before one of them approached Olivia. "Ms. Taylor," he said respectfully, inclining his head. "May we have a moment?" Olivia closed her notebook and looked up, her expression neutral. "Of course," she replied, her tone steady. The man gestured toward the aisle, and Olivia rose gracefully, following him a few steps away from her seat. The second representative remained near Jessica, whose glare had turned icy at the sight of the corporate team. The representative addressed Olivia directly, his voice measured. "We've reviewed the situation and the information provided. Your booking and seat assignment are valid, and we apologize for any inconvenience caused by this incident. Please rest assured, we're taking this matter seriously." "Thank you," Olivia replied, her calm demeanor unwavering. "But this is about more than an apology. Incidents like this reflect a deeper issue, one that goes beyond a single flight." The representative nodded, his respect for her evident. "We understand. And we're already implementing a full review of our staff training and protocols to ensure such incidents are handled appropriately in the future. As a gesture of goodwill, we'd like to extend complimentary first-class travel for the next 2 years." Olivia inclined her head slightly. "I appreciate the gesture," she said. "But what I truly want is accountability, not just for myself but for everyone who has faced similar treatment. I trust your review will address these concerns thoroughly." "It will," the representative assured her. "You have our word." Meanwhile, the second representative turned his attention to Jessica. His tone was polite but firm as he addressed her. "Ms. Moore, we've documented your behavior during this incident. Effective immediately, your platinum preferred status with the airline is revoked. We expect all passengers to adhere to our policies and treat others with respect." Jessica's jaw dropped, her face pale with disbelief. "You can't be serious," she sputtered. "Do you know how much money I've spent with this airline?" The representative's expression remained unmoved. "Your loyalty is appreciated, but it does not exempt you from following our code of conduct. Security will escort you from the plane." A gasp rippled through the cabin as 2 security guards appeared at the door. Jessica's protests grew louder, but her words fell on deaf ears. The guards escorted her down the aisle, her fury echoing faintly as the cabin door closed behind her. As the plane began to taxi to the runway, the tension that had gripped the cabin started to dissolve. Olivia leaned back in her seat, her notebook resting on her lap. She allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. This wasn't just about her seat. It was about standing up for her worth, about refusing to shrink in the face of entitlement and prejudice. And though the journey to change was far from over, Olivia knew this small victory mattered, not just for her but for anyone who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong. As the plane lifted into the sky, Olivia gazed out the window, the lights of the city shrinking below. A faint smile touched her lips. This flight, like so many moments in her life, had been a battle. But it was a battle she had won with grace, resilience, and an unshakable belief in her own value. As the plane soared through the skies, Olivia Taylor's quiet resilience left an indelible mark, not just on those aboard but on a system that needed change. Her steadfastness reminded us that respect isn't granted by status, it's earned through actions and integrity. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a lesson in dignity, courage, and standing firm for what's right. Thank you for joining us on Life Stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales that empower, uplift, and transform. See you in our next story.